Alexander felt the corner of his lips ever so slightly twitch as he hurried through the mansion's oversized halls. Inwardly, he firmly reminded himself that patience is a virtue. Still, he couldn't help but feel like now, of all times, really was not the time for games. When he finally made his way to his destination after crossing what felt like acres of hallway, he stopped in front of the massive door, briefly. He lifted his hands, took a deep breath, and then allowed them to slowly sink down along with his gradual exhale. Once his lungs were empty, he ran his hand through his hair to try and bring some order into it. Then he took a far more moderated breath before opening the massive door with the small remote he had previously been handed, so he could even hope to move the darn thing. As he pressed the button down, his body, out of ingrained habit, already braced for the loud noise the enormous engines would bring with them. However, almost like the feeling of missing a step while walking up the stairs, the prepared tension ran into nothing for a moment, as the anticipated noise didn't sound out as he had come to expect. His aware mind took a moment longer to notice it than the passive control over his body did, and his eyebrow just began to raise in confusion when the door suddenly started to move, the ensuing noise now hitting him twice as hard because his guard had begun to lower right as it came. He jolted back half a step, his right hand instinctively grabbing the pendant around his neck as he felt his heart rate pick up, and a little bit of a surprised tingle spreading into his lips. The door's unexpected behavior didn't help his already agitated state of mind at all, and so he felt his expression morph into an irritated grimace as he shook off the momentary surprise. With an exasperated sigh directed at both the door and at himself, he took a step towards it to move on from this, only to stop dead in his tracks right as he was about to cross the threshold. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he felt a subconscious part of himself push back against the movement. Memories of the caller's door slamming down just inches before his feet flashed through his mind, and his eyes inadvertently shot to the tracks in the wall that housed the door's sturdy metal plate, following them all the way up to where it currently disappeared into the ceiling. For a bit, the guy had simply stood there, staring at the dark strip of metal that hid what had to be at least a ton of material away from his view, almost right above his head. It was still, and he could feel his heart heavily pounding all the way up into his ears as his eyes briefly lost focus from the strange way they were staring. Before his eyes, the door ceased to be a door, instead turning into a guide page. A familiar voice suddenly tore him out of his spiraling thoughts, forcing his gaze to snap forwards into the room, where he found the highly questioning face of Brother Abbott, who had likely been curiously staring at him like that ever since he had opened the door. Is something the matter? The man stood in front of an open suitcase and held a half-folded blanket in one hand, making it clear that Alexander had interrupted him while he was packing up. Using the brief jolt to his system as a springboard to pull himself together, Alexander quickly shook his head and, though still hesitant, stepped through the door far swifter than was in any way necessary or reasonable, basically throwing himself across the threshold before catching himself on the other side. "I received your message," he replied, once he was fully in the room, running his hands over his clothes to smooth them out, only for his eyes to widen as he realized he had just smeared long red streaks over his white shirt. His gaze shot to his hand, where he saw 4 thin lines of slowly trickling blood run down his palm where he had seemingly punctured it by grabbing onto his pendant too tightly during his brief days. It was not an unusual occurrence, but this time it had seemingly happened without him noticing the damage. "Wonderful," he sarcastically muttered, with a smack of his lips, as he looked down at the mess on his shirt, even though he could do little more than dismiss and live with it for now. In the meantime, he could see Brother Abbott tilt his head somewhere in his periphery. "Message?" the friar asked, confused, as he quickly finished folding up the blanket and stuffed it into the open suitcase. "What message?" Alexander scowled, now even more unamused by the brother's games than he had already been, especially since it had now led to him ruining his shirt. "I am not in the mood, Brother Abbott," he informed sternly, while pulling a tissue from his pocket to try and quell the bleeding of his hand. Still, he tried his best to not lose himself to the temptations of anger, and he even used the pain in his palm to help himself focus. "We are on borrowed time, so please do not try to waste it." Abbott now tilted his head to the other side, and, to Alexander's surprise, there was genuine confusion on the friar's face. Brother Abbott was certainly an occasional jokester, however a convincing actor he was not. Whenever he thought he had won one over on you, he was certain to let you know, which in turn gave Alexander pause when that usual smug expression was nowhere to be found. Therefore, instead of immediately continuing the conversation, Alexander quickly pulled out his phone, his face scrunching up into a dark pondering, as he quickly checked to make sure he hadn't somehow been horribly mistaken. Just a few minutes ago, Abbott had urgently texted him that there was something important they had to discuss, and that he could not go into detail via text. When Alexander had in turn responded that that was nonsense, and that he should simply get out with it, Abbott had proceeded to ignore those messages and calls, ultimately leading to where they now found themselves. Now, the guide felt the breath become briefly stuck in his throat, as his eyes found his own messages which had gone ignored earlier, only to now see the bright red indicator stating, "Not delivered," clearly displayed next to each of them, while the messages themselves had become greyed out. Something that was most certainly not the case just a few minutes ago, when his agitation at being ignored had reached such a point that he decided to approach Abbott about it in person. A ringing filled his ears as his finger began to move on its own, absently scrolling up past the dozen or so undelivered messages of his that were filling the chat while seeking out the one that had started this all. Although he hadn't actually decided to search for it, his aware mind still recoiled when he finally found it, so much so that he actually dropped his phone, leaving it to clatter against the ground loudly as the sound echoed through the enormous room. Obviously noticing the shock on his guide's face as he stared down at the fallen device, Brother Abbott quickly pulled his own phone from his pocket, following the logic that Alexander had mentioned a message from him, and therefore likely checked the chat logs between the two of them. When the friar opened the chat, Alexander knew that he obviously didn't see any of the undelivered messages he had tried to send him. Instead, from his side of the logs, it would look like the last interaction between them was a message sent from Abbott that never got an answer from the other side. Of course, Alexander now knew that Abbott never sent that message, and the confused and slightly disturbed look on the brother's face, which was a rarity to see as part of his expressions, confirmed that gut feeling once again. Even if finding a message that he himself never wrote wasn't disconcerting enough already, the contents of the message surely amplified the effect tenfold at least. Because when Abbott checked the chat now to see just what had Alexander so alarmed, he didn't find the original vague message of needing to talk to the guide, and not being able to give details over the phone. No. Instead, the message had been replaced, a small edited signifier, next to the now much shorter field of text indicating as much. Now, the new message was only made up of 3 short words. 3 short words which, however, managed to carry much, much more weight than the previous bait message Alexander had originally received ever could. Made you look. Could it just be some kind of residual message that the system spat out once it was rebooted? Fleet Admiral Santo asked, having contacted the first, and admittedly most readily available under the current circumstances, expert on the matter of hyperspace communication systems he could think of, immediately after the cryptic message had reached them. On the screen in front of him, the still somewhat dishevelled and very much not dressed for the occasion image of the Tria Kakumina's mind representative, dressed in white silk PJs and holding a steaming cup of freshly brewed coffee, rubbed her eyes as she tried to wake herself up. Dr. Zoya Boyko's chin-length platinum hair hung with a few strands wildly out of place as she squeezed her eyes shut tight to focus on her current thought. "No," she said, and although she seemed tired in every other regard, her voice was firm and clearly sure of what she was saying without a room for doubt. "If the message was in the process of being delivered as the hyperspace collapsed, it would have simply been lost. And if the message actually reached the satellite before the stretch collapsed, then there is no reason why it wouldn't have sent out right away. Especially not without any of its usual encryptions. Whoever sent it, and sent it like this, clearly did so purposefully." Santo had no reason to doubt her words, especially since the only remote hint of her tiredness that managed to make its way into her manner of speaking was the slightly stronger than usual accent that coloured her words. It seemed like someone was either toying with them, or trying to tell them something. It's a dead end, so cramped. He thought about those words, even if they seemed like utter nonsense out of context. A dead end? A dead end? A dead end. The Fleet Admiral's eyes flicked over to a different screen, where constant status updates from his various troops and informants were constantly coming in to keep him on track of the current situation. According to the reports, although some issues with things like television and certain net services reportedly remained, communication had been successfully re-established, and the situation at the galaxy's core was stable. A brief report of Avezalon's, co-signed by both Admiral Krieger and Councilman Aldwin, was attached, that detailed a bit of unrest on the Council station, but nothing they could not handle. Some of the officers were therefore hopeful that the defense and re-establishment of communication between the core worlds and Earth had made whatever play that was planned against them too risky in their attackers' eyes, buying their people at the core more time to prepare for any eventualities. However, the Fleet Admiral stared at the report for a long moment, and the longer he did, the deeper the folds in his forehead became. With the quick press of a button, he opened communication to Reason. "Do me a favour, and triple-check that message's source," he ordered, once someone had picked up on the other end. "Especially the palindrome." He didn't wait for a response before he turned his gaze back to the representative, who was currently stretching to wake the rest of her body up. The fabric of her pyjamas strained a bit against her arms, as she as seemingly bought them before gaining a good bit of bulk later on. "Say, Doctor." He opened and paused briefly to make sure that he once again had her attention before carrying on with his question. "I personally mostly have contact with it as values on a sensor or numbers on a screen, so forgive me if it is a stupid question," he explained himself briefly, before shifting his lips and looking at her, with his face dipping deeper and deeper into concern. "But is there a way to tell if a hyperspace stretch leads into a blind end?" "But how is it possible that you got completely locked out of that entire communication without even noticing?" James asked loudly, in the vague direction of his phone, which laid on the mattress next to him while put on loudspeaker, since both of his arms were too preoccupied to bother with holding it as he spoke. The things which the other side of the call was hearing right now were likely interesting, to say the least. However, Avezalon seemingly didn't let that bother her, as she replied to his not exactly politely phrased question right away. "I wish I could tell you, James," she explained, her tone far more diplomatic than his was, while also carrying a hint of guilt at her own supposed impotence. "It's not just that I couldn't reach her, or not connect to the system. It was more like the entire system disappeared somehow. Not just disappeared from my view, but disappeared from my awareness." While the realized gave her explanation, James's doctor, as well as a nurse, were busy pushing against his shoulders with gentle, well, mostly gentle force, as they tried to highly encourage him to lie down again, which didn't happen for the first time today. "Sir, please, you really shouldn't get up yet," his doctor tried to tell him in a calm voice. As she pushed against him, her face carried both professional concern and a hint of surprise, which seemed to stem from her wondering about how he could even put up much of a fight, as he did in his current state. "Please remember, you agreed to remain in bed and recover." James grit his teeth and released a huff, as he planted his mechanical hand flatly on the bed to help keep himself upright as they pushed against him. His scarred lungs protested against the excursion, but he managed to keep the urge to cough, fought down for the moment. Avezalon had briefly paused her explanation so it wouldn't get swallowed in the scuffle, but once things turned quiet enough once more, she continued. "It is hard to describe, and terrifying to be entirely honest, especially since I can only grasp it in hindsight. It is as if the connection to the Admiral simply ceased to exist for me, even while I was actively discussing and trying to connect to it. I was aware of the concept of the connection, but not of his actual existence." She tried to put what had happened into words, though admittedly it was a bit hard to conceptualize. Then again, it wasn't like James was in the best situation or state of mind right now to really dig his teeth into the thought experiment it posed. I suppose the best thing I could compare it to is a momentary loss of object permanence, while simultaneously processing the intelligence to understand the idea of object permanence. I was aware on some level that it still had to exist and could therefore discuss it as if it did, but my awareness was stunted to a degree that I could not actually fathom its existence anymore, even if I was conceptually aware of it. James briefly tried to push against his caretakers one more time to get to his feet. But for all his strength, he wasn't going to overpower two grown adults, while his muscles were still waking up from a coma, and his lungs were running at highly reduced capacity. Not quite allowing himself to be brought fully onto his back, he instead fell against the supporting mechanical arm, which quickly shifted in its shape to be a more practical support for his weight. "That sounds terrifying," was all the commentary James could offer to the realized's explanation, while he tried to catch his winded breath. The truly terrifying part is that I am only aware of it now that it is over, Veslon admitted, her tone speaking of clear discomfort. While James sat there, breathing heavily as he got to contemplate on the ancient and deep-seated fear humans held towards the idea of false memories and a faulty perception of the world, his doctor and the nurse carefully pulled their hands away from his shoulder before the former gave him a very displeased look and imperiously gestured for him to lie down. "We've been over this," she warned, in a firm but still somewhat caring tone. "Do not make me sedate you." James sighed and, briefly, thought about bringing up his right to leave the medbay AMA if he wanted to. But in the end, rational thought did barely win out over his unrelenting need to act, even if he had no real idea what exactly he would do in terms of acting exactly. The station was descending into chaos, with many of his friends caught in the middle of it, with little chance to escape, while who knew what kind of unseen force was trying to lock his mother away. And he was here, lying in bed. But what was he going to do? Go down there and probably eat shit against the first even half-decent opponent he ran into, with a good possibility that that opponent would be Gravity? Now that would be real useful. So, he therefore said, as he slowly lowered himself back onto his back for what wasn't the first time today, but hopefully would be the last now. What you're saying is you have no idea if the same thing is still happening to you with something else, because you would only notice that it was previously the case if you suddenly became aware of it again, correct? I'm afraid that is the sad reality, Veslon confirmed with a glum voice, and I have no idea how to counteract or mitigate it. Whatever is wrong with me, if something is still wrong with me, I cannot find the cause. Diagnostics come up empty. A step-by-step reboot of my functions, and even a code overhaul, yielded no results. Either I am cured, there is nothing more to find, or any attempts at a remedy failed. The terrifying part is, I have no way of knowing which is the case until it is too late. James released a heavy sigh. So our last bastion of reality did not hold, he said quietly, not wanting to make it seem like it was Veslon's fault, even if a certain anger bubbling within him most certainly wanted to try and find fault somewhere. However, what was happening to Veslon sounded far more scary and even violating than simply being unable to tell who was really calling you on your phone. And he had absolutely no way of even trying to come up with a solution, considering just how little was even known about Realized. Just keep trying, please, was all he could say in the end, while a sudden spell of exhaustion began to take him, only to then immediately shoot up again as a sudden alarm rang out across the ship. A few minutes earlier. "Any news from Earth?" Vice Admiral Kuzadi asked his communication officer, although his own eyes remained glued to the screen showing the drone footage of the psychopomps in the process of dispersing the crowd that was still threatening the now freed Admiral, as well as the soldiers who had been dispatched to rescue her. Luckily, it seemed that the appearance of truly heavy weaponry on the scene had taken the steam out of the rioters' defiance, and they began to flee the scene in large numbers before they would possibly have to contend with the nominal Deathbringers that were now descending upon them. Here and there, some of the violent brutes attempted to hurl some of their projectiles up towards the drone, but it became clear quickly that none of them had the necessary aim or strength to come even close to threatening any of the sophisticated weapons. "No response yet, sir," the officer replied, which was the furthest thing from the news Cassidy wanted to hear at the time. "I am not sure if they are responding or if our messages aren't going through." The Vice Admiral hummed deeply, trying to force a neutral expression as he processed that information. "And of Veselon?" he asked, though he basically already knew the answer. "Says the connection appears fine to her, but cannot guarantee her confidence in that assessment." The officer quickly confirmed exactly what he thought. Cassidy suppressed a sigh. What was especially getting to him was the irony. Not all that long ago, the mere information that I realized could be effectively gaslit would have been a near invaluable find for their strategic and preparatory departments. Not all that long ago, the mere information that I realized could be effectively gaslit would have been a near invaluable find for their strategic and preparatory departments. And now? Now they were somehow in a position where exactly that had become detrimental to them. What a cosmic joke. His thought didn't quite get to finish, as the sun's various sensors for spatial distortion suddenly began to flare up in warning. Being this close to the galaxy's core, and with it the absolute main traffic center of the entire community, they already had to dial down the scanner's sensibilities to hyperspace, simply because the background noise around these parts was so much higher than basically anywhere else. Yet despite that adjustment, all the measurements suddenly went haywire all at once, reporting that the newly set specification limit for concerning activity had been more than just surpassed. "Incoming hyperspace stretches!" an officer yelled out, what the systems had already made everyone aware of, her voice briefly catching in her throat, as she obviously couldn't quite believe the numbers that the systems were reporting to her. "The large ones! 300 and counting!" 300? The Vice Admiral checked his own screen to confirm the number, even if he had no reason to believe that his officers would lie to him. Of course, 300 hyperspace stretches approaching and departing from a station of this size, over some time, nothing out of the ordinary. But over 300 of them suddenly popping up almost all perfectly, at the same time. "Raise all alarms!" he ordered immediately. "Be prepared for anything!" Immediately, he proceeded to draft up urgent SOS signals to be sent out to Earth and all of their allies, which he would immediately expand to all surrounding systems if there came any active signs of hostility, while the bridge erupted into hurried business. 300 ships at least. If this was an invasion, they had no choice but to retreat. Luckily, the sun was faster than any ship that could be brought against her, so being potentially pursued wouldn't be much of a problem. Though, even though other members of the community weren't known to employ hyperspace collapse or hyperspace injection in their strategies, it would be detrimental to rely on that. Therefore, they would have to leave quickly before any ship would get the chance to mess with their transport. Which meant it would be in their best interest to get out first and ask questions later. "Ma'am," the Vice Admiral therefore quickly said, once he opened the connection to the Admiral back up, "I'm going to need you to hurry it up." Leaning his weight onto his crutch, Reprieg directed his eyes down to his personal assistant. Not too long ago, he had received a row of messages that had heavily indicated to him that things were reaching their hot phase, and that he specifically should be making his way to a certain detention facility. There, he would await further instructions. Well, there he was, and await he did. Not too far away, he could hear one of the ongoing riots that had begun to consume the station quite suddenly, loudly proclaiming their displeasure with the changes the galaxy was seemingly allowing to happen. Although he had heard nothing specific about it, Reprieg could only assume that those hadn't simply happened on their own. Likely, they were connected to him being here. He would probably get more information as soon as whatever would happen next was going to happen. So far, he was left waiting. Seemed like he arrived a little earlier than expected. That or things got delayed somehow. Either way, he wasn't going to bother investigating. Excuse me? A slightly quivering voice suddenly pulled him from his thoughts, and he felt his ear and trunk twitch as his body inadvertently reacted to its familiar sound. Not familiar in the way that he knew the owner of the voice, but familiar in the way that he instinctively recognized it as coming from a throat like his own. Looking up lazily at first, he quickly snapped to more attention as his eyes fell upon the young man who was approaching him. His fur was slightly darker than Reprie's, and the white patterns on his back were therefore more pronounced. However, that was the last thing that Reprie noticed about his appearance, because everything else was overshadowed by the orange smudge of blood that was seeping through the fur on the man's temple, oozing out from in between his fingers that he pressed over the wound, which also pulled Reprie's gaze to his right eye, which was swollen shut by a growing hematoma. The man seemed slightly unsteady as he stood, and Reprie quickly took a step towards him in case he was about to lose his balance. "Could I maybe ask to use your assistant?" the man asked, his voice still shaking as he watched Reprie approach him with little immediate reaction, seemingly in shock after whatever happened to him. Mine got broken." Reprie's eyes widened even more as they flicked to the spot on the man's arm where he would likely usually wear the device. Now he only saw disheveled fur, with a few big patches ripped out from it, revealing dark spots of bruised skin to his view. "What happened?" Reprie gasped in concern, once he reached one level with the young man. "Who did this to you?" The young man took a moment longer than Reprie would have liked to reply. He seemed to not process the question for a bit before he finally blinked and made eye contact. I ran into one of those protests," he said, his voice still empty of any emotion apart from weakness. "They did not appreciate me being around. They did not appreciate my recording." Reprie's expression darkened as he began to put two and two together, looking once again at the previous position of the seemingly ripped-off assistant. "Savages," he commented, throwing a venomous glare in the direction he could hear the commotion coming from. Then he returned his gaze to the man and gently touched his shoulder with his free hand. "It's all right. I'm going to call emergency services for you." Still constantly glancing at the young man to make sure he wouldn't tip over, Reprie quickly worked on his assistant again, calling the station's emergency line. Almost immediately, a robotic voice came out of the device's speakers. "You have reached the Council Station's emergency line. We are currently experiencing an unusually high amount of calls, and no operators are available to receive your call. To avoid lengthening hold times, please write a message to the emergency number with the nature, location, and any additional information about your emergency, and hang up the line if you are able to. The messages will be triaged for importance, and helpers will be sent your way. If you are not able to write out a message, please stay on the line. Your emergency will be processed as soon as at all possible." Reprie clicked his tongue as he hung up the call. What a joke! Emergency services that got overwhelmed by an emergency? Then what were they there for? Though his anger then dampened and was quickly replaced by a heavy stone in his stomach, as he once more heard the shouting of the rioting protesters. An emergency. Quickly he began to write up the requested message, hoping that it could be processed more quickly if it was the recommended method of contacting the services. As he did, the young man's empty eyes absently scanned over him. "What happened to your leg?" he asked, his voice now even weaker than before, and Reprie could see how his unsteadiness grew. Without thinking too much about it, he quickly pressed his crutch, which he could barely use while needing both hands to type anyway, into the young man's hand. "A work accident," he half lied, while making sure the young man really grabbed onto the walking aid. "Here, lean on this." It would have probably been better to get him to sit down. However, given the proximity of the ongoing riot, Reprie was worried that he wouldn't get the young man back on his feet quickly enough, should they need to move before emergency services arrived. Where was security in all this anyway? Once the man followed his advice and leaned his weight onto the crutch, Reprie quickly got back to furiously typing out the message, now balancing on his remaining leg with small, simple adjustments. When he was just about finished and read it over one more time to make sure he had left nothing important out, or lost it to a typo, he realized that he should probably add the young man's name as well. However, just as he looked up to inquire about it, the door he had been waiting in front of for at least 20 minutes previously suddenly opened. Rapri couldn't quite help but glance in its direction, and when he did, his stance immediately turned a bit stiffer, as he saw none other than the Leader Supreme step out of that damned door. Which in turn almost made him lose his own balance now, as bending his knee and moving his spine was sort of important to him standing on one leg. Turning in not the most dignified of hopping manners, he quickly looked towards her and gave a brief sign of respect. He had no idea how or why exactly she was allowed to simply walk free like that, but right now he wasn't going to question it. "Hi, Matriarch," he greeted her with a heavy swallow, before nervously glancing back at the man behind himself. "I'll be with you in just a moment,
Oh my! What happened to him?"
High Matriarch Tua asked, approaching the two Sipperslang with slightly hastier steps, and pointing one end of her trunk in the injured young man's direction. Rapri blinked a bit at her concerned tone, but he quickly cleared his throat. "Some of the protesters attacked him," he explained, gesturing in the direction of the ongoing noise. "I was just about to contact emergency services." The young man nearly tipped over as he brought his head all the way back into his neck to try and look up at the enormous Sadiatos, though luckily he managed to bring his weight back forwards and onto the crutch, just in time to not meet the ground intimately. The High Matriarch released a displeased huff through her trunk as she tilted her head to better look down at the small person.
"Oh no, how unfortunate," she said,
taking in the injured man's wide stare up at her massive form, before then lifting her head up to gaze in the direction of the loud riot.
"Kashalenga's really whipped something up there, didn't he? Such undirected violence. And he thinks he is any better than the people he deems to vivify? If anyone seems to enjoy the taste of blood, it is those hooligans."
Rapri stood confused for a moment. He didn't disagree with what Tua said, but she sounded so genuine. However, he couldn't imagine that all of this had somehow happened without her input. Yet he had worked for her for a long time. He knew the way she spoke when she was making a point, and the way she spoke when she really meant something. And this was the latter case. She truly hated those people.